What would you do if the world took everything, and in a final act of mockery, left you with a single, rusted monument to your own ruin? When Thomas died, everyone in Redemption Creek expected his ambitious partner, Marcus Corbett, to take over the entire freight business. They expected his young widow, Clara, barely 22, to be sent away with a pittance, a quiet charity case to be forgotten by winter. Instead, at the public reading of the will, Corbett, with a face of practiced solemnity, presented her with a deed. Not to a house, not to a share of the business, but to a forgotten quarter-acre of alkali flat 12 miles out of town, distinguished only by a single, derelict freight car abandoned on a dead-end spur of track. The men in the dusty courthouse shuffled their feet to hide their smirks. The women looked at Clara with a pity so sharp it was its own kind of cruelty. People said she was a fool to accept it. They said she should have thrown the useless paper back in Corbett's face. But she took the deed, her face as still as deep water, and folded it into her palm. Her silence was mistaken for weakness. Her composure was mistaken for shock. But when Clara packed her few belongings and walked out of town toward that worthless plot of land, she carried more than just a piece of paper. She carried a promise made to a dying husband, a whisper of a plan set in motion a generation before. The truth would change everything. The walk to her inheritance was a pilgrimage through dust. The sun beat down on the cracked earth, and the horizon shimmered with heat, offering mirages of water that vanished upon approach. Redemption Creek fell away behind her, its sounds replaced by the hum of insects and the low sigh of hot air moving over the scrub. By the time she saw it, the sun was a molten coin sinking behind the western mesas, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and purple. The train car sat exactly as described, a long, oxidized box of iron, its wheels swallowed by dirt and time. It wasn't just rusted, it was a sculpture of decay, its brown and red surfaces peeling like sunburnt skin. The track it rested on ended abruptly, two steel lines pointing to nowhere. This was her home now. She approached it slowly, her boots scuffing the dry soil. The air was still and heavy. She laid a hand on the metal flank of the car. It was still warm from the day's heat, a dead, lingering warmth. There was no welcome here. No comfort. Just the vast, indifferent silence of the land and this monument to failure. She slid the heavy door, groaning on its track, just far enough to slip inside. The interior smelled of baked metal, mouse droppings, and a deep, ancient dust. Strips of fading daylight pierced the gloom through holes in the roof. It was a tomb. But it was hers. And in the gathering dark, she sank to the floor, not in despair, but in a state of quiet, focused resolve. The work would begin at dawn. Clara started with the floor, sweeping out decades of accumulated debris with a broom fashioned from a salt cedar branch. The dust was so thick it was like a fine soil, coating her skin and clothes, filling her lungs. She worked until her arms ached, her movements methodical and unhurried. It was in the far corner, under a pile of rotted canvas, that her fingers brushed against the edge of a loose plank. It was not warped like the others, it felt deliberately cut. Using the pry bar she'd carried with her, she worked it free. Beneath it, nestled in the dark space, was a small metal box, heavy and dense. It was locked tight, the mechanism rusted shut. She spent an hour trying to force it, but the lock held firm. Exhausted and thirsty, she sat back on her heels, studying the box in the dim light. It was then she heard the crunch of boots on gravel outside. An old man stood silhouetted in the doorway, his frame stooped, his face a road map of wrinkles. He held a wooden canteen. "Figured you might be made in this," he said, his voice raspy. He introduced himself as Sam, a retired Gandhi dancer who'd worked the lines in this territory for 50 years. He lived in a small shack a mile down the wash. "Knew Thomas's father," Sam murmured, looking not at her, but at the train car itself. "He was always out here. Pacing this ground." People thought he'd lost his senses. Sam squinted at the box in her hands. "That looks like one of his." He didn't ask what was inside. He just nodded, a flicker of something unreadable in his faded eyes, and left her to her work. The water was cool and clean. It tasted of hope. The next week was a blur of relentless labor. Clara used scavenged sheets of tin to patch the holes in the roof, hammering them into place with a river stone. The sound was a lonely percussion in the vast emptiness. She spent her last few coins in town on a half-dozen scrawny chickens and a bag of grain, her presence in the general store met with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. She built a small, sturdy coop against the sheltered side of the car, weaving a fence from dried brush. Her true project, however, was inside. With the same methodical pace, she began hauling buckets of the richer soil from the nearby wash up into the train car. She built long, shallow planting beds directly on the floor, lining them with rocks and layering the precious earth inside. It was an absurd, back-breaking endeavor. One afternoon, 2 of Marcus Corbett's men rode out on their horses. They stopped a short distance away, watching her haul a bucket of dirt, her face streaked with sweat. Their laughter was loud and sharp in the quiet air. "Look at her," one called out. Building a farm in a box, they rode off, still laughing. The report they gave Corbett back in town was dismissive, but it planted a seed of unease in him. Madness he could understand. Grief he could understand. But this was industry. It was purpose. It felt like a plan, and that was something he could not abide in someone he had already written off. He sent one of the men back a few days later with a small pouch of coins. "Mr. Corbett offers you this for the deed," the man said, not bothering to dismount. A gesture of goodwill. Clara looked from the pouch to the man's smug face, then turned and walked back inside the train car without a word. The silence was her answer. That night, fueled by a simmering anger, Clara returned to the metal box. She worked the pry bar into a weak point in the hinge, leveraging her entire weight against it until, with a tortured screech of metal, the lid gave way. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She expected coins, or perhaps a weapon. But there was no treasure inside, not in the conventional sense. The box was filled with papers. On top lay a set of meticulously hand-drawn maps of the territory, but they were unlike any she had ever seen. They were covered in strange symbols and numbers, with lines indicating not roads or property boundaries, but layers of rock and sediment deep beneath the Earth's surface. Beneath the maps was a surveyor's journal, its leather cover cracked with age. The pages were filled with her father-in-law's familiar, spidery handwriting, but the text was a complex cipher of measurements, astronomical observations, and geological notes. Tucked into the final page was a single, heavy iron key, its bow stamped with a serial number. It was the key to a lock she had never seen. The next time Sam stopped by, bringing her a small sack of beans, she showed him the journal. He ran a gnarled thumb over the script. "That's his hand, all right," he said softly. He was a water witch, but not with a stick. With numbers. Used to talk about a river. A river that ran underground. Said it was the lifeblood of this whole valley. Sam shook his head. Everyone told him he was chasing a ghost, but Clara, looking at the precise, scientific detail on the maps, knew it wasn't a ghost. It was a secret. The interior of the train car began to transform. Shielded from the relentless sun and the desiccating winds, the shallow beds of soil became a secret garden. The first tender green shoots of lettuce pushed through the dark earth, followed by the feathery tops of carrots. Tomato vines, staked with twine hanging from the ceiling, began to climb. The air inside, once stale with decay, now smelled of damp soil and growing things. The chickens, safe in their coop, provided a steady supply of small, precious eggs. Clara had created an ecosystem in a metal shell, a pocket of impossible life in the middle of a dead land. Her existence became a quiet rhythm of tending, watering, and waiting. The laughter from the town had long since faded, replaced by a grudging curiosity. People making the trip to the next settlement would sometimes see her, a lone figure moving with quiet purpose around the rusted car. They saw not a madwoman, but a survivor. One evening, a woman from the poorer side of Redemption Creek appeared at her door. Her name was Mary, and her youngest child was wasting away with a fever. "Heard you had eggs," Mary said, her voice low, her eyes avoiding Clara's. She held out a carefully mended wool blanket. "It's all I have to trade." Clara looked at the woman's worn face, at the desperation in her eyes, and nodded. She returned with 4 eggs, warm from the nest. It was a simple exchange, but it was the first crack in the wall of her isolation. Word of the trade filtered back to town. And from there, it filtered back to Marcus Corbett. A woman surviving was one thing. A woman thriving, trading, becoming a resource, that was a threat. Marcus Corbett decided to handle the matter himself. He rode out to the train car, his expensive saddle creaking, his posture radiating an unshakable confidence. He dismounted and strode toward Clara, who stood near the chicken coop, scattering grain. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "This has gone on long enough," he said, his voice smooth but edged with steel. "There's been a misunderstanding regarding the deed. This spur line is, and always has been, part of my primary freight grant. You are trespassing." He gestured to the two men who had accompanied him, their hands resting near their hips. Clara did not flinch. She simply stood her ground, her gaze level. "This land is mine," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The deed is filed." Corbett chuckled, a low, condescending sound. "A piece of paper filed by a sentimental old clerk. It won't stand. Now, you will take your chickens and be gone by morning." He took a step forward, his shadow falling over her. It was in that moment of quiet menace that the sound of another horse approaching broke the tension. A man on a sturdy bay gelding rode into the clearing. He was dressed not as a rancher or a drifter, but in the practical, durable clothes of an engineer or a man of science. He dismounted with an air of brisk authority. "Marcus Corbett?" the man asked, his eyes sharp and direct. Corbett, thrown off balance by the interruption, nodded curtly. "I am," he said. "And you are?" The stranger pulled a folded document from his saddlebag. "My name is David Hale. I'm a federal surveyor. I'm here to verify the claim markers for parcel 734B, pursuant to a formal inquiry filed 6 months ago by Mr. Thomas Gable." He looked past Corbett, his gaze settling on Clara. "And I believe you have the key." Corbett's face, a mask of arrogant certainty only moments before, now registered a flicker of confusion. "Key? What key?" "This is railroad land." The surveyor, Hale, ignored him completely, his attention fixed on Clara. She reached into the pocket of her worn dress and produced the heavy iron key from her father-in-law's box. Hale nodded, a small, satisfied smile touching his lips. "Excellent. The federal marker shouldn't be far." He consulted a map from his bag, its crisp lines and official seals a world away from the hand-drawn charts Clara possessed. According to the original survey, filed by Franklin Gable 30 years ago, the primary reference marker is located 100 paces due north from the terminus of the spur line. Sam, who had been watching from a distance, now stepped forward. "I know the spot," the old man rasped. "Always thought it was just a pile of rocks." He led the way, with Hale and Clara following. Corbett and his men trailed behind, their blustering confidence replaced by a sullen, watchful silence. Sam stopped at a low, unassuming cairn of stones that looked no different from 1,000 others scattered across the landscape. Hale knelt and, with surprising strength, began removing the top layers of rock. Beneath them was a flat, iron plate, almost completely obscured by dirt, with a keyhole at its center. Hale looked at Clara. She stepped forward, knelt in the dust, and inserted the key. It turned with a heavy, grinding click. With a grunt, Hale lifted the plate, revealing a dark, cylindrical cavity. Inside, protected by a thick, waxed canvas pouch, was a set of official documents, their ribbons and seals perfectly preserved in the dry, still air. Hale carefully unrolled the papers. He read them aloud, his voice clear and precise in the quiet afternoon. The documents constituted a federal claim, not for the land itself, but for the subterranean water rights beneath it. Franklin Gable, a certified geologist and surveyor, had spent years charting the underground hydrology of the entire basin. He had discovered what the maps in the box depicted: a massive, slow-moving aquifer, a vast underground river, fed by snowmelt from the distant mountains. It was the sole source of sustainable water for hundreds of square miles. And he had legally registered the primary access rights, the very heart of the aquifer, to the single, otherwise useless quarter-acre of land designated as parcel 734B. The derelict train car was not a piece of junk, it was the legally designated, permanent structure required by federal law to anchor the claim. The claim is ironclad, hail-stated, looking directly at Corbett. It predates your freight grant by a decade. Whoever owns this parcel controls the water for this entire territory. The silence that followed was absolute. The buzzing of the insects seemed to amplify. Corbett stood frozen, his face ashen. He had built his empire on controlling the scarce creeks and wells, buying up land and squeezing the smaller ranchers dry. He had assumed the land was worthless. He had laughed at the gift. In his greed, he had handed the one thing that could destroy him to the one person he had wronged the most. Thomas, knowing he was dying, hadn't left his wife a ruin. He had left her a kingdom, hidden in plain sight. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Marcus Corbett's power, built on the illusion of water scarcity, evaporated overnight. His legal challenges were dismissed before they even reached a judge. The federal claim was unassailable. When word spread through Redemption Creek and the surrounding ranches, the initial disbelief gave way to a wave of quiet, profound satisfaction. The man who had held them all hostage to his prices and his whims had been undone not by a rival baron or a cattle war, but by a 22-year-old widow in a rusty boxcar. The town's memory is long. They remembered the smirks in the courthouse. They remembered the jokes about her dirt farm. Now, they saw the story for what it was, a masterpiece of patience and foresight. Franklin Gable's obsession was not madness, it was genius. Thomas Gable's final act was not a surrender, it was a checkmate planned years in advance. Clara was no longer the pitiful widow. She was the inheritor of a legacy, the quiet, unassuming guardian of the valley's future. Men who had once laughed at her now tipped their hats, their eyes holding a new respect. Women who had pitied her now sought her out, not for charity, but for counsel. She had endured their scorn in silence, and now she accepted their respect with the same quiet dignity. The power she now held was immense, but she wielded it not as a weapon, as Corbett had, but as a tool for restoration. The legacy was not just about water, it was about justice. Months bled into a year. The landscape around the train car began to change. The constant drone of a drilling rig had given way to the steady, rhythmic pulse of a new pump, drawing clean, cool water from deep within the earth. A small, sturdy house was being framed with lumber bought and paid for, its foundation solid, its porch facing the sunrise. The train car remained, its rusted exterior now a deliberate landmark. Inside, it was a lush, thriving greenhouse, providing fresh vegetables not just for Clara, but for many families in town. The land around it, once a cracked alkali flat, was now divided into irrigated plots. The green was a startling, vibrant color against the dun-colored hills. Redemption Creek was living up to its name. Small ranchers, who had been on the verge of bankruptcy, now had fair access to the water they needed. The town was growing, not with the transient boom of a gold strike, but with the steady, rooted confidence of a place with a future. One evening, as dusk settled, painting the sky in soft pastels, Clara stood on her unfinished porch. Sam sat in a rocking chair nearby, whittling a piece of wood, a comfortable silence between them. She looked out at the land, at the distant lights of the town, at the dark, solid shape of the train car. It was no longer a symbol of loss or humiliation. It was an anchor, a beginning. She had arrived with nothing but a worthless deed and a secret promise. Now, she was the source. She had not just survived, she had brought life back to a forgotten place, proving that the greatest strength is not in what you take, but in what you quietly, patiently, and purposefully build.